In the packed Las Vegas Exhibition Center, a 79-year-old Chuck Norris was about to be written off as a relic. What began as a respectful martial arts showcase turned volatile when Steven Seagal mocked him as too old to fight and pushed for a public showdown. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical aging celebrity. For over 40 years he had been a world champion, a movie icon, and a U.S. Air Force veteran renowned not just for his roundhouse kick, but for turning combat into philosophy. When Seagal pressed the challenge, he had no idea he was provoking a man who embodied fundamentals sharper than any flashy technique. Norris stepped forward with quiet precision, delivering a response so subtle it would shake Seagal's confidence and electrify the arena. What began as bravado became revelation. The celebration of martial arts in Las Vegas would be remembered not for spectacle, but for the night. Discipline, humbled ego, and silence proved stronger than any boast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Las Vegas Exhibition Center pulsed with anticipation, a sea of bodies filling every available seat. Spotlights sliced through artificial fog, casting dramatic shadows across the central ring where legends would soon stand. This wasn't just another martial arts showcase, it was Masters Across Time, bringing together the pioneers who had defined generations alongside the rising stars who sought to redefine the future. In the front row, separated from the pressing crowd by a velvet rope and two stone-faced security guards, sat Chuck Norris. At 79, the lines on his face had deepened, mapping decades of discipline and wisdom. His posture remained impeccable. Spine straight, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly on his knees. He wore a simple black button-down and slacks, no flash, no unnecessary adornment. He had arrived early, declined the private entrance offered to VIPs, and shaken hands with every staff member who approached him. Now he sat in quiet observation, occasionally nodding to acknowledge fans who waved from a respectful distance. "That's him," whispered Miguel Santos, a welterweight prospect with 3 professional wins and dreams bigger than his record. He nudged his training partner, Darius, eyes wide. The man invented his own martial art. Not adapted, not modified, invented. Darius nodded, studying Chuck from across the arena. "My grandfather had his poster on the wall. Said Chuck was the real deal before real deal became something people just say." The crowd's murmur suddenly swelled into excited chatter. The main entrance doors had swung open, flanked by an entourage of assistants, photographers, and what appeared to be a personal videographer. At the center of this controlled chaos strutted Steven Seagal. His black silk shirt unbuttoned far enough to display both a collection of spiritual necklaces and a generous glimpse of chest. His trademark ponytail was immaculate. His sunglasses remained firmly in place despite the dimmed arena lights. "Steven! Over here!" Photographers called, their cameras flashing as Seagal paused, turning to offer what he clearly considered his best angle. "The man knows how to make an entrance," Miguel observed, watching as Seagal high-fived fans who pressed against the barriers, his rings glinting under the lights. "That's what it's about these days," Darius replied, his tone measured. Being seen. The exhibition's organizer, former world champion Tomas Chen, intercepted Seagal halfway down the aisle, guiding him toward the VIP section, where other luminaries of the martial arts world had gathered. The path would take them directly past Chuck Norris. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed across the arena, momentarily drowning out the excited chatter. "Welcome to Masters Across Time, where legends and legacies collide. Tonight, we celebrate the timeless spirit of martial arts through those who defined it and those who carry it forward." The crowd erupted, their collective energy vibrating through the building's very foundation. On the main screen, footage began to play historic matches, iconic movie scenes, training demonstrations spanning decades. The montage cut between footage of Chuck Norris's devastating roundhouse kicks and his thoughtful instruction of young fighters, then shifted to scenes of Seagal executing his signature Aikido throws. As the video played, Seagal reached the VIP section. Chen gestured toward the empty seat, reserved next to Chuck. "Stephen, I believe you know Chuck Norris." Chuck stood, extending his hand with a cordial nod. "Stephen, good to see you." Seagal clasped Chuck's hand briefly, his grip performatively firm, his smile not quite reaching his eyes behind the dark glasses. "Chuck, still showing up to these things, I see." "Wouldn't miss it," Chuck replied evenly. "These young fighters deserve our support." Seagal settled into his seat, immediately gesturing for an assistant to bring him water. Support's one thing. Knowing when to step aside is another. If Chuck registered the barb, his expression didn't show it. He simply returned to his seat, focus returning to the ring where the exhibition's first demonstration was about to begin. Across the arena, Riley Matthews, the exhibition's lead interviewer, checked her notes while a makeup artist made final touches. At 35, Riley had built a reputation for insight and respect in a world often dominated by sensationalism. Tonight's lineup of interviews would be career-defining conversations with the architects of modern martial arts. 2 minutes, Riley, her producer said through her earpiece. "Seagal first, then we'll grab Norris during the kickboxing demonstration." Riley nodded, scanning her research one last time. Seagal's recent projects had been direct-to-video at best, his public appearances increasingly dominated by grandiose claims about secret government work and close relationships with world leaders. Chuck, meanwhile, had stepped back from the spotlight, focusing on his charitable foundation and occasional mentorship of promising fighters. The first demonstration, a breathtaking display of traditional kung fu forms executed by twin brothers who moved with mirror-perfect synchronicity, concluded to enthusiastic applause. As the brothers bowed and exited, the announcer's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, throughout the evening, we'll be hearing from the masters themselves. Please welcome Riley Matthews, who will be conducting exclusive interviews for tonight's broadcast." Riley strode toward the VIP section, camera crew in tow. Seagal was already adjusting his collar, preparing for the spotlight. She noticed Chuck shifting slightly, creating space for the camera crew without being asked. "Mr. Seagal," Riley began once the red light blinked on. "Welcome to Masters Across Time. You've been a dominant force in martial arts cinema for decades. How does it feel to see your influence on today's generation of fighters and action stars?" Seagal leaned back, his posture expansive. "It's humbling, truly. When you pioneer something, when you bring authentic Aikido to the masses like I did, you don't think about legacy. But looking around, I see my techniques everywhere. These young fighters, these new action stars, they're all borrowing from what I built." Riley nodded professionally. "Your Aikido background certainly brought something unique to martial arts cinema. Speaking of influences, we have several generations of legends here tonight. How would you characterize the evolution of martial arts from the pioneers to today's practitioners?" Something shifted in Seagal's expression, a calculated gleam behind the tinted glasses. He turned slightly, ensuring the camera caught his profile as he gestured vaguely toward Chuck. "Evolution is the perfect word. Martial arts evolves, and practitioners need to evolve with it. Some do." He paused for effect. "Others get left behind. Look at Chuck here. Great in his day. No disrespect, but the game changes. Chuck's what? 79 now? Too old to fight, too set in outdated techniques. That's just reality." A collective gasp rippled through the audience near enough to hear. Riley's professional smile faltered momentarily. Chuck remained perfectly still, his breathing unchanged. I bring innovation, Seagal continued, voice rising to ensure it carried. My Aikido is alive, adaptable. That's why I'm still relevant while others are just memories. The silence that followed seemed to expand, filling the arena despite the background music and distant conversations. Riley's producer hissed in her earpiece, "Follow up on that. This is gold." But before Riley could formulate a question, the crowd's murmur transformed into a chant, starting with a few voices in the VIP section and spreading outward like ripples in water. Chuck! 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 All eyes turned toward Chuck Norris, who sat, with the same composed expression, seemingly untouched by the insult that had just been hurled across the martial arts world. The camera panned to capture his reaction, and in that moment of expectant silence, the gathered thousands collectively wondered the same thing. How would the legend respond? Riley Matthews felt sweat beading at her hairline, her producer's voice buzzing in her ear. Stay on this, stay on this. The chanting swelled, Chuck, 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 as thousands of eyes turned toward the man who had defined an era of martial arts. Steven Seagal's smirk remained fixed, though something flickered behind his sunglasses as the crowd's reaction registered. He'd expected laughter, perhaps, or at least the awkward shuffling that acknowledges a social boundary crossed. Instead, the arena had transformed into a chorus of support for the very man he'd attempted to diminish. Chuck Norris remained still, his weathered face revealing nothing of the thoughts behind his steady gaze. The only perceptible change was a slight softening around his eyes as he registered the chanting crowd. When he finally moved, it was not with the righteous anger many expected, but with the deliberate calm of a man who had faced far greater storms than a colleague's wounded ego. Mr. Norris. Riley recovered quickly, shifting the microphone toward him. Would you care to respond? Chuck's voice, when it came, carried no trace of defensiveness. I appreciate Steven's perspective. We all see the world through our own experiences. The simplicity of the response seemed to disarm Seagal momentarily. He shifted in his seat, gold bracelets clinking as he adjusted his posture. But, Chuck continued, each word measured, I've always believed that martial arts isn't about age. It's about discipline, respect, and continuous learning. He turned slightly toward Seagal, meeting his gaze directly. I'm still learning every day. That's why I'm here. The crowd erupted again, this time in applause rather than chants. Seagal's smile tightened fractionally. Learning is one thing. Seagal cut in, voice rising to be heard over the crowd. But there comes a point when the body simply can't execute what the mind knows. That's not disrespect. It's biology. He gestured expansively. The new generation needs clear space to innovate, not shadows from the past. In the fighters section, Miguel leaned forward, eyes wide. Is he seriously doubling down? Darius shook his head slowly. Man doesn't know when to stop. The tension in the arena shifted, crystallizing into something more potent than mere celebrity drama. This was now about something fundamental to everyone present: respect for the journey, acknowledgement of the path walked before them. Riley, sensing the weight of the moment, attempted to steer towards safer ground. Both of you have contributed immeasurably to martial arts. Perhaps we could... Let's settle this, Seagal interrupted, removing his sunglasses with a flourish. Not with words. That's always been the beauty of martial arts, hasn't it? Proof through action. He turned fully toward Chuck now. I propose a demonstration. Right now, in that ring. Show these young fighters what continuous learning looks like at 79. The crowd fell silent. The collective intake of breath, almost audible. Camera operators swiveled, capturing the moment from every angle. Social media would explode within seconds. Tomas Chen stepped forward, his face a carefully composed mask of concern. "Gentlemen, tonight's exhibition has a carefully planned schedule. Schedules can be adjusted." Seagal interjected smoothly. "Isn't that right, Chuck? Unless, of course, you'd prefer to keep your legacy safely in the past where it can't be challenged." Chuck's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in his posture, an almost imperceptible straightening of his spine, a slight adjustment of his hands on his knees. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the suddenly hushed arena. A demonstration. It wasn't a question, but a statement, 4 simple syllables that held the weight of 5 decades of discipline. Seagal's smile widened, triumphant. A simple exchange. Show these people what's real, what's relevant. Chuck nodded once, then rose to his feet with the fluid motion of a man half his age. The crowd's reaction was immediate whistles, cheers, and a renewed chant of his name rolling through the stands. Chuck raised a hand slightly, and the noise subsided. His quiet authority, commanding attention without effort. "I didn't come here tonight to prove anything," he said, voice clear but not raised. "But I've never turned down an opportunity to learn." The distinction was subtle but unmistakable, recasting Seagal's challenge not as a chance to defend his ego, but as another moment in a lifetime of growth. Several of the younger fighters nodded unconsciously, recognizing the mindset that separated masters from mere practitioners. Seagal stood as well, tugging at his silk cuffs. "Perfect. A learning opportunity for everyone." He gestured toward the ring with a theatrical sweep of his arm. "Shall we?" Riley's producer was practically shouting in her ear. "Stay with them! Whatever happens, keep the camera rolling!" As both men moved toward the ring, the crowd parted instinctively, creating a path. Their contrasting approaches were immediately apparent, Seagal striding ahead, acknowledging the crowd with nods and waves, his entourage scrambling to keep pace. Chuck walking steadily, eyes focused on the ring itself, occasionally pausing to shake an extended hand or acknowledge a veteran fighter with a respectful nod. In the fighters section, a tense debate had erupted. "Seagal's still active, still trains daily," Miguel argued. "Chuck hasn't done a public demonstration in what? 5 years? Doesn't matter," Darius countered. "Fundamentals don't fade, and Chuck's fundamentals were never for show. But Aikido against karate? Different ranges, different philosophies." An older coach nearby leaned in. "That's exactly the point, boys. This isn't about techniques. It's about what lies beneath them." As Chuck approached the ring steps, a young fighter barely 20, with the nervous energy of someone new to the professional circuit, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Norris," he said, voice barely audible above the crowd, "my grandfather studied under you in the 70s. Said it changed his life." He extended a hand, uncertain, "Just wanted to say thank you." Chuck paused, fully present in the moment despite the arena's electric anticipation. He clasped the young man's hand firmly. "What's your name, son?" "Jason Miller, sir." "Your grandfather taught you?" Jason nodded, surprised Chuck had made the connection. "Then, I should be thanking you," Chuck said quietly. "You're carrying it forward." He glanced toward the ring where Seagal was already removing his jewelry, handing pieces to assistants. "That's what matters." With that, Chuck ascended the steps and slipped between the ropes with the ease of muscle memory that never truly fades. The ring, which had hosted multiple demonstrations throughout the evening, now seemed transformed, no longer merely a performance space, but hallowed ground where something authentic would unfold. The announcer, sensing the gravity of the moment, adopted a more subdued tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, We are privileged to witness an unscheduled demonstration between two icons of martial arts, Steven Seagal and Chuck Norris. Seagal had removed his silk overshirt, revealing a fitted black t-shirt that emphasized his still powerful build. At 67, he remained imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate and grounded as he stretched his wrists and rolled his neck. Chuck made no such preparations. He simply stood center ring, hands relaxed at his sides, watching Seagal with the patient focus of a man who had spent a lifetime reading opponents' intentions before they themselves knew what they would do. Thomas Chen climbed into the ring, visibly torn between professional concern and recognition of the moment's significance. "Gentlemen, I must remind you, this is an exhibition, a demonstration only." Seagal nodded magnanimously. "Of course. A friendly exchange between colleagues." Chuck simply inclined his head in acknowledgement. Chen looked between them once more, then stepped back, raising his hand. "Whenever you're ready." The arena fell so silent that the subtle shift of Seagal's weight from his back foot to his front was audible to those nearest the ring. He circled slowly, hands raised in classic Aikido position, beckoning Chuck forward with a slight gesture. "Age before beauty, Chuck," he said, voice pitched to carry. "Show us what you've got." Chuck remained centered, his stance neither defensive nor aggressive, simply present. "After you, Steven." Something flickered across Seagal's face, perhaps irritation at the lack of engagement, perhaps genuine uncertainty about how to approach an opponent who offered neither aggression to redirect nor anxiety to exploit. He edged closer, hands weaving in the circular patterns characteristic of his style. "Come on, Chuck," he called. Louder now. "Don't keep us waiting. Some of us still have careers to get back to." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A murmur rippled through the crowd, part tension, part discomfort, at the increasingly transparent attempts to provoke. Chuck's expression never changed. He simply adjusted his position slightly, maintaining the same distance from Seagal, despite the other man's movement. Frustration flashed across Seagal's face. He stepped forward more decisively, reaching for Chuck's wrist in a textbook Aikido entry. "Let me show you how it's done in the modern era." What happened next occurred so smoothly that many in the audience would later swear they missed it, even when watching replays. As Seagal's hand extended, Chuck's posture shifted minutely, not retreating, not attacking, simply adapting. Seagal's grasp met empty air as Chuck pivoted slightly, allowing the larger man's momentum to carry him forward, off balance. Seagal recovered quickly, turning the stumble into a circular step that brought him around for another approach. This time his movement was sharper, less performative, and more focused. He launched a combination, a feinting grab followed by a swift palm strike aimed at Chuck's shoulder. Chuck's response was economical to the point of invisibility. A slight tilt of his torso, a subtle redirection with his forearm, and Seagal's strike passed harmlessly by. No counterattack, no exploitation of the opening, just calm neutralization. The pattern repeated 3 more times, each of Seagal's approaches growing more committed, each of Chuck's responses remaining measured and minimal. The contrast was becoming unmistakable. Seagal's increasing exertion against Chuck's stillness, elaborate technique against fundamental principle. In the stands, Miguel whispered to Darius, "He's not doing anything. Why isn't he attacking?" The older coach leaned forward again. "He's doing everything. Watch his feet, not his hands." Indeed, while Seagal's movements were visibly dynamic sweeping arm motions, Dramatic footwork. Chuck's adjustments were nearly imperceptible. Only the closest observers noticed how he consistently maintained his balance point. How each shift of weight was timed precisely to render Seagal's techniques ineffective without direct opposition. A bead of sweat traced down Seagal's temple as he paused, reassessing. The smirk had vanished from his face, replaced by a furrowed concentration. The easy victory he had anticipated was clearly not materializing. "Interesting defensive strategy," he called, voice slightly breathless. "But defense alone never won any fights, Chuck." Chuck's response was quiet, but carried clearly in the hushed arena. "I'm not here to win a fight, Stephen." The simple statement hung in the air, its implications settling over the audience. This wasn't a competition to Chuck, it was a demonstration of principle, exactly as had been proposed. Something shifted in Seagal's expression, a hardening, a narrowing of focus. When he moved again, it was with greater intent. He closed distance rapidly, executing a lightning-fast combination that would have been impressive at any age. A sweeping entry, a grappling control point, and a takedown maneuver executed with technical precision. For the first time, Chuck responded with more than passive redirection. As Seagal's hands established their grip, Chuck moved not away, but toward, stepping inside Seagal's circle of power. His movements were crisp, efficient, with none of the wasted energy that had begun to characterize Seagal's increasingly forceful attempts. The resulting exchange lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but unfolded with such clarity that even untrained observers could read its progression. Seagal's advantage of height and weight dissolved against Chuck's perfect timing. His attempted control turned into momentary confusion as Chuck's position shifted unexpectedly. And then, in a moment that would be replayed millions of times on social media by morning, Chuck executed a simple sweeping technique that caught Seagal mid-step. The fall wasn't dramatic, no flipping through the air, no violent impact, just the inevitable result of compromised balance meeting gentle but irresistible direction. Seagal found himself on one knee, Chuck's hand lightly but firmly on his shoulder, preventing further momentum but offering support. The moment froze in perfect tableau, Seagal kneeling, Chuck standing beside him, neither triumphant nor dominant, but steadying. Then, with the same quiet control that had characterized his every movement, Chuck extended his hand. "Good exchange," he said simply. "Thank you." The crowd erupted, the tension of the previous minutes dissolving into thunderous appreciation. Not for victory or defeat, there had been neither in the traditional sense, but for the unambiguous demonstration of what martial arts, at its core, had always been about. Efficiency over flash, principle over personality, respect over ego. Seagal remained still for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then, with visible effort, he clasped Chuck's offered hand and rose to his feet. In the stands, the young fighter Jason Miller turned to his teammates, eyes wide with the revelation of witnessing something he had heard about but never truly understood until this moment. "That," he said quietly, "is what my grandfather meant." The applause continued to roll through the arena in waves, punctuated by chants of "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" that seemed to rise from every section simultaneously. Camera flashes strobed across the ring, capturing the moment from countless angles. Seagal standing now, composing his features into what he hoped resembled gracious sportsmanship. Chuck, hands still extended in the gesture of mutual respect that formed the bookends of traditional training. Riley Matthews' producer was practically hyperventilating in her earpiece. "Get in there! Get the first comment! Go! Go! Go!" But as Riley approached the ring, microphone extended, Tomas Chen intercepted her with a subtle but firm hand on her arm. "Give them a moment," he murmured. His eyes, crinkled at the corners from decades of his own training, held a certainty that brooked no argument. Some things need to breathe before they're packaged. Inside the ring, the two men stood in momentary isolation, despite the thousands watching. Seagal brushed imaginary dust from his knee, adjusting his posture to reclaim some semblance of the imposing presence that had been so effortlessly neutralized. "Not bad for an old man," he said, pitching his voice low enough that only Chuck could hear. "But I was holding back. Exhibition rules." Chuck's response was a simple nod. As was I. No emphasis. No hidden barb. Just acknowledgement of a shared understanding. Something flickered across Seagal's face, perhaps recognition, perhaps the first glimmer of genuine respect. Before he could respond, however, the moment was broken by the arrival of his entourage at the ring apron. Assistants proffering water bottles and towels, with the anxious efficiency of those whose employment depended on anticipating unspoken needs. "Stephen! Stephen!" Cameras and phones were thrust toward the ring. What happened in there? Was that planned? Seagal turned toward the voices, his public persona sliding back into place. He accepted a towel with a theatrical wipe of his brow, then flashed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just sharing some knowledge with an old colleague. You know how it is, some learn faster than others." The joke fell flat, its transparent attempt at face, saving, hanging awkwardly in the air. Chuck, meanwhile, had stepped back, declining the spotlight with the same ease with which he had commanded the ring moments before. He nodded once to Seagal, then turned toward the ropes where several younger fighters had gathered. Their expressions a mixture of awe and renewed appreciation. Among them stood Jason Miller, the young fighter whose grandfather had trained under Chuck decades earlier. His eyes shone with the particular light of someone witnessing the confirmation of a truth they had been told but had not yet experienced firsthand. "Mr. Norris," he began hesitantly, as Chuck approached. I've never seen anything like it." Chuck's weathered face creased into a genuine smile, not the practiced camera-ready expression of his film days, but the warm acknowledgement of shared understanding. "What did you see, Jason?" The question caught the young fighter off guard. He had expected platitudes, perhaps, or the kind of generic wisdom that legends often dispense to maintain their mystique. Instead, Chuck's inquiry was immediate, specific. Mentor to student. "I saw." Jason paused, organizing his thoughts. "Efficiency. No wasted movement. And something else." He searched for the right words, like you were having a completely different conversation than he was. Chuck nodded. "Pleased. Your grandfather taught you well." Nearby, Miguel and Darius had edged closer, drawn by the rare opportunity to hear wisdom directly from a source, rather than filtered through stories and social media clips. "But he was coming at you hard," Miguel interjected, unable to contain his confusion. "Some of those techniques look solid. Why not counter? Show him what you've got." Chuck's expression remained patient. What would that have proven? The simple question hung in the air as the young fighters exchanged glances. "That he was wrong about you," Darius ventured. "That you've still got it. Is that what this was about?" Chuck asked quietly. Proving him wrong? The fighters fell silent, reconsidering the exchange they had just witnessed through a different lens. Chuck continued, his voice low enough that they had to lean in slightly to hear him over the still buzzing crowd. "In 50 years of martial arts, I've learned that the need to prove yourself to others is the heaviest weight you'll ever carry. And the moment you set it down is the moment you begin to truly understand what all this," he gestured toward the ring, "is actually for." In the center of the ring, Seagal was holding court, his voice carrying as he offered his perspective to the cluster of reporters who had managed to push their way forward. "Certainly a good technical exchange. Chuck's foundations are solid, no one's ever questioned that. but you saw how defensive his approach was. That's the old-school thinking, survive rather than dominate. Today's martial arts landscape demands more. Chuck either didn't hear or chose not to acknowledge the commentary. His focus remained on the circle of younger fighters, whose numbers had grown as word spread through the competitors section that Chuck Norris was sharing insights ringside. "Mr. Norris," another young fighter spoke up, "you barely moved in there. But nothing he did worked." "How?" "Foundation," Chuck replied simply. "When your base is solid, you don't need to move much to remain effective." He glanced toward the ring where Seagal continued his impromptu press conference. "The martial arts journey is like building a house. Some focus on decorating the rooms before the foundation is complete." The metaphor wasn't lost on the gathered fighters, several of whom nodded thoughtfully. Across the arena, Riley Matthews had finally maneuvered past Tomas Chen's protective buffer and reached the edge of the ring. Her cameraman jostled for position as she extended her microphone toward Seagal, who was mid-explanation. "Different philosophies, different approaches," he was saying. "My Aikido is fluid, adaptive. Chuck comes from a more rigid, traditional background, both valid, just different applications." "Mr. Seagal," Riley cut in, "you initially characterized Chuck Norris as too old to fight, and suggested his techniques were outdated. Has what just happened changed your perspective?" The question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. The crowd, sensing the potential for drama, quieted slightly. Seagal's expression tightened momentarily before settling into a practiced smile. "Context is everything, Riley. We were discussing evolution, adaptability. What you just saw was a friendly exchange between colleagues who respect each other's contributions to martial arts." He gestured expansively. "Chuck's a legend, no question. His place in history is secure." The careful non-answer wasn't lost on Riley, whose journalism instincts recognized the dodge. "So, you stand by your earlier characterization?" Seagal's smile remained fixed, but something hardened behind his eyes. "I think what happened in this ring speaks for itself. Chuck showed he's still got some moves. I demonstrated the flowing adaptability of modern Aikido. Everyone learned something." Before Riley could press further, Tomas Chen stepped in smoothly. "And that's precisely the spirit of tonight's exhibition, learning across generations, styles and conversation rather than opposition." He glanced at his watch. "And now, we should continue with our scheduled program. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next demonstration. The Chen family's rare eagle claw form, preserved through 15 generations." The announcement successfully diverted attention, allowing Seagal to exit the ring with his entourage, while the next performers prepared to enter. As he descended the steps, his composure slipped momentarily, a flash of frustration crossing his features before the camera-ready smile returned. Meanwhile, Chuck had begun making his way back to the VIP section, still surrounded by younger fighters eager for any additional insights he might share. Unlike Seagal's dramatic procession through the crowd, Chuck moved quietly, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. As he passed near the timekeeper's table, an older man rose stiffly to his feet. Jim Kelly, the pioneering African-American martial artist, whose career had paralleled Chuck's own. Though age had slowed his once lightning movements, the dignity and power that had made him an icon remained undiminished. "Chuck," he said simply, extending his hand. "Jim." Chuck clasped it warmly. "Good to see you." No elaborate greeting, no performative backslapping, just the quiet acknowledgement between men who had walked similar paths and understood what the journey had cost and given. "That was something else," Kelly said, nodding toward the ring. "Brought back memories." Chuck smiled slightly. "Different ring, same lessons. Always." Kelly's eyes crinkled at the corners. You handled it well. Better than I might have. We've all got different gifts, Chuck replied. Your patience was never your strongest virtue. The gentle jab elicited a rich chuckle from Kelly. Still isn't. But watching you in there, he shook his head, reminded me what it looks like when someone's got nothing to prove. As the two exchanged quiet words, Miguel nudged Darius, pointing toward them. Look at that living history right there. Darius nodded, suddenly aware they were witnessing something that transcended the evening's drama. A connection forged through decades of shared experience. Mutual respect built on understanding rather than competition. You notice neither of them needs to talk about how great they are? He observed quietly. They just know. Across the arena, Seagal had reached his seat, immediately surrounded by his entourage. An assistant handed him his phone, screen glowing with notification after notification as clips of the ring exchange began circulating online. His expression darkened momentarily as he scanned the comments. They're missing the point, he muttered, scrolling rapidly. This wasn't about... He stopped abruptly, jaw tightening, as he read something particularly displeasing. Meanwhile, the eagle claw demonstration had begun in the ring, the ancient form's precise movements executed with breathtaking speed and control. Under normal circumstances, it would have commanded the arena's full attention. Tonight, however, conversations continued to buzz throughout the stands, all centered on what had transpired between the two action stars. Did you see how Seagal went at him full speed, and Chuck just wasn't there? Man's 79, and moved like water. That's some next-level mastery. Seagal talked all that trash, and then got schooled without Chuck even trying. The observations rippled through the crowd, perspectives shaped by each viewer's own relationship to martial arts. Some focused on the technical exchange, others on the interpersonal drama. But all recognized they had witnessed something authentic, a rare moment of substance in an industry often dominated by spectacle. As Chuck returned to his seat in the VIP section, now noticeably distant from where Seagal sat scowling at his phone, Riley Matthews approached cautiously. Her producer was still urging her through the earpiece to get the money, quote, but her own journalistic instincts suggested a different approach. Mr. Norris, she began, would you share your thoughts on what just happened? Chuck considered the question for a moment. Two martial artists had a brief exchange. Not much to say beyond that. But surely there's more to it. Riley pressed gently. After Mr. Seagal's comments about your age and relevance, this demonstration seemed particularly meaningful. Chuck's expression remained serene. Martial arts has never been about proving others wrong, Riley. It's about proving yourself right, day after day, year after year. The only opponent that matters is the one you faced yesterday. The profound simplicity of the statement caught Riley off guard. In a world of sound bites and manufactured drama, such genuine wisdom felt almost disorienting. And what would you say to younger martial artists who witnessed tonight's exchange? She asked, finding her footing again. Chuck glanced toward the fighters section, where eager faces were still turned in his direction, despite the ongoing demonstration in the ring. I'd say that technique gets you only so far. Eventually, you need to understand the principles beneath the movements. Kicks and punches. Age with the body. Principles are timeless. As Riley thanked him and moved away, her producer's voice buzzed in her ear again. That's it? Go back. Ask him about Seagal. Specifically. We need controversy. But Riley switched off her earpiece, suddenly certain that she had captured something far more valuable than controversy, wisdom that couldn't be condensed into clickbait. The exhibition continued. Martial arts demonstrations flowing one after another in a showcase of human capability and artistic expression. Yet throughout the arena, The atmosphere had been permanently altered by the brief exchange between Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal. Like ripples spreading across still water, their encounter had touched everyone present, each person interpreting what they'd witnessed through the lens of their own experience. In the fighters section, heated discussions had broken out among the younger martial artists. Their normal competitive barriers temporarily dissolved by shared witness to something transcendent. "That's what mastery looks like," Darius insisted, leaning forward intently. "Not flashy moves or how many boards you can break, it's economy of motion, perfect timing." Miguel shook his head, still processing. But he barely did anything. If this had been a real fight— "That's the whole point," interrupted an older fighter who had been silently listening. He was in his 50s. His face weathered by decades under harsh training hall lights and competition spotlights. Norris showed exactly what a real fight should be: minimal risk, maximum efficiency, no ego. Seagal's technically skilled, another fighter offered. Those Aikido entries were textbook perfect. Technique without understanding is just choreography, the older fighter replied. What we just saw was the difference between someone who performs martial arts and someone who embodies them. Near the VIP section, Chuck had returned to his seat, seemingly unaffected by the momentous exchange that had the rest of the arena buzzing. He watched the current demonstration with genuine appreciation, occasionally nodding at particularly well-executed techniques. To casual observers, he might have seemed entirely focused on the present moment. The previous drama, already forgotten. But Jason Miller, who had positioned himself where he could observe both Chuck and Seagal, noticed something subtle yet revealing. Every few minutes, younger fighters would approach Chuck hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as his warm reception became evident. They would lean in, ask a question, listen intently to his response, and leave with expressions of renewed purpose. No selfies requested, no autographs sought, just brief moments of genuine connection and transmission of knowledge. Seagal, meanwhile, sat rigidly in his seat, surrounded by his entourage, yet somehow isolated. His attention remained fixed on his phone, thumbs scrolling rapidly as clips of the exchange proliferated across social media. Occasionally, he would mutter something to an assistant, who would nod vigorously in agreement. When fans approached, they were intercepted by his security detail, allowed through only if they projected the proper degree of adulation. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. One man building connections, the other building barriers, one focused outward, the other inward. One seemingly untroubled by how the world perceived him, the other consumed by it. Thomas Chen observed this tableau with the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen generations of martial artists rise and fall. He made his way to where Jim Kelly was seated, settling beside the pioneer with a soft grunt that acknowledged their shared accumulation of training injuries. "Some things never change," Kelly remarked without preamble, nodding toward the two action stars. Chen followed his gaze and smiled slightly. "And some things never should." "You knew this would happen," Kelly said. It wasn't a question. Chen's expression remained impassive, though a hint of satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "I knew something would happen. The specifics were up to them." "Clever old dragon," Kelly chuckled. Seating them together, having Riley interview them back to back. "The young ones needed to see it," Chen said simply. "This generation, so much technical skill, so much athletic ability, but—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "But they're learning to fight before they learn why," Kelly finished for him. "I've noticed it too." Chen nodded, watching as another young fighter cautiously approached Chuck, received a warm welcome, and engaged in earnest conversation. They chase techniques like collectors, but miss the principles. They pursue fame before they establish character. "And tonight you gave them a comparison they won't forget," Kelly observed, an appreciative smile spreading across his face. "Masterfully done." Chen demurred with a slight shake of his head. I merely created the space. Chuck and Steven filled it with who they truly are. Across the arena, Riley Matthews had retreated to a quiet corner, reviewing the footage her team had captured. Her producer hovered nearby, simultaneously ecstatic about the viral potential, and frustrated by Riley's refusal to push for more sensationalism. "We should get them together," the producer insisted. Side-by-side interview, reaction to what happened. The clips are already exploding online. Riley continued scrolling through the footage, pausing at the moment when Chuck had offered his hand to Seagal after the takedown. "That's not what this is about," she said quietly. "What are you talking about?" "This is exactly what it's about. Conflict, resolution, drama. It's perfect content." Riley looked up, her expression thoughtful. "No. I mean, that's not what martial arts is about. At least not according to everyone I've interviewed who truly understands it." The producer waved dismissively. "Save the philosophy for the director's cut. We need to strike while this is hot." Riley's thumb hovered over the screen, frozen on Chuck's face as he spoke to the young fighters afterward, that moment of genuine transmission that had nothing to do with cameras or public perception. Something crystallized in her mind. "I'm going in a different direction with this," she said with sudden certainty. "What different direction?" The network wants viewership, and they'll get it. But not through manufactured drama between two aging action stars." She stood, a plan forming. "They'll get it by showing people something authentic in a world drowning in fakery." Before her producer could protest further, Riley was already moving toward the fighters section, where the heated discussions continued among the younger martial artists. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner near the exit tunnel, Seagal had finally abandoned his social media vigil. Pocketing his phone with a sharp gesture of frustration, his publicist approached cautiously, aware of his employer's darkening mood. "The online reaction is mixed," the publicist began carefully. "But we can shape the narrative. A few strategic interviews. Some context about the exchange." "I know what happened in there," Seagal interrupted, voice tight. "He got lucky with the timing. If we'd continued—" "Of course." The publicist nodded quickly. "It was just a brief demonstration, not a real indication of—" "Exactly." Seagal straightened his shirt cuffs, composure returning, as the explanation aligned with his self-perception. "A momentary exchange that people are over-interpreting. Typical." The publicist sensed safer ground. "We should emphasize your generosity, how you created a memorable moment for the fans by inviting a legend back into the spotlight." Seagal considered this, nodding slowly. "Yes, that works." He glanced across the arena to where Chuck sat, still engaging with a steady stream of younger fighters. Something complicated flashed across his face, a mixture of resentment, confusion, and perhaps the faintest trace of genuine curiosity. "What is he telling them?" he muttered, almost to himself. The publicist followed his gaze. "Probably just war stories. You know how it is with the old-timers." But Seagal wasn't listening anymore. He was watching as Chuck demonstrated something to a young female fighter, a subtle adjustment to her stance, nothing flashy. Yet her face transformed with sudden understanding. The exchange took perhaps 15 seconds, yet it seemed to contain volumes. For the briefest moment, something like doubt crossed Seagal's features. Not doubt about his abilities or accomplishments, but something deeper, more fundamental. Then it was gone, replaced by the practiced confidence that had become his public armor. "Let's get out of here," he said abruptly. "I've got that dinner with the producers from Shanghai." As his entourage scrambled to comply, Seagal cast one final glance toward Chuck. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, an acknowledgement without words. The weight of decades of parallel journeys hanging in the space between them. Then Seagal turned and strode toward the exit, his security team clearing a path through fans and photographers. In the ring, the current demonstration, a breathtaking display of capoeira's acrobatic movements, concluded to enthusiastic applause. As the performers bowed and exited, the announcer's voice boomed once more. Ladies and gentlemen, as we reach the midpoint of our exhibition, we invite you to visit our Masters Pavilion, where several of tonight's featured artists will be available for questions and photos. The crowd began to shift, some heading for the concessions, others making their way toward the designated area where martial arts luminaries would be holding court. Chuck rose from his seat, politely declining an offer of escort from one of the event staff. As he moved against the flow of the crowd, his progress was unhurried yet deliberate, acknowledging greetings with nods and brief smiles, but maintaining his course. Jason Miller, who had been watching from nearby, realized Chuck was heading not toward the Masters Pavilion where he was scheduled to appear, but toward the fighters' warm-up area behind the main arena. Curiosity overcoming hesitation, Jason followed at a respectful distance. The warm-up area was nearly deserted now, most fighters either watching the exhibition or preparing for their own demonstrations later in the program. Chuck entered quietly and moved to a corner where practice mats had been laid out. With methodical precision, he removed his shoes, placing them neatly at the edge of the mat, then stepped forward and began what was clearly a familiar routine. Jason stopped at the entrance, suddenly feeling like an intruder witnessing something private. Yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. What unfolded before him was nothing like the dramatic exchange in the ring earlier. No opponent, no audience, no external validation, just a solitary figure moving through fundamental patterns with meticulous attention to detail. Chuck's kata was not flashy. No spectacular kicks or lightning-fast combinations, just the foundation movements of traditional karate executed with a precision that transformed simplicity into artistry. What struck Jason most was the quality of presence Chuck brought to each movement, as focused and intentional in this empty room as he had been under the gaze of thousands. "He does this before and after every event," a quiet voice said from beside Jason. "Has for 50 years. Jason turned to find Jim Kelly standing nearby, his own attention fixed on Chuck's practice. "Why?" Jason asked. "I mean, at his level, with everything he's accomplished." Kelly smiled slightly. "That's why he's at his level. That's how he's accomplished everything." He nodded toward the solitary figure on the mat. "The real work of martial arts happens when no one's watching. The public moments, they're just echoes of what you do in private." As they watched, Chuck completed his pattern, returned to his starting position, and bowed formally to the empty room. Only then did he notice his audience. Rather than showing embarrassment or surprise, he simply nodded in acknowledgement. "Mr. Norris," Jason began hesitantly, "I was hoping, that is, I wanted to ask about what happened in the ring." Chuck reached for a small towel, wiping his hands methodically. "What did you see happen?" Again, the question, rather than an answer. Jason was beginning to recognize this as Chuck's teaching method, drawing insight out rather than imposing it. "I saw." Jason paused, organizing his thoughts. "I saw someone who didn't need to prove anything." Chuck nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. "But what I don't understand is why accept the challenge at all. You could have just let his comments go. Stayed in your seat." "Could I?" Chuck asked quietly. The simple question hung in the air, prompting Jason to reconsider the situation from a different angle. Kelly watched the exchange with approval, recognizing the delicate moment of transmission happening before him. "I guess. No," Jason said slowly. "Not without sending a different kind of message." Chuck nodded. "Every action teaches something. Every non-action too. The question isn't whether to respond, but what lesson your response will teach. And what lesson were you teaching Seagal? Jason asked. A hint of a smile crossed Chuck's face. Who says the lesson was for him? The implication dawned on Jason gradually that perhaps the entire exchange had been less about putting Seagal in his place, and more about demonstrating principles to everyone watching. Before he could pursue this further, however, the moment was interrupted by the arrival of an event coordinator, slightly breathless. Mr. Norris, we've been looking everywhere for you. The Master's Pavilion is packed. Everyone's asking for you. Chuck nodded, accepting the interruption with grace. I'll be right there. He turned back to Jason. Keep training. The answers come through practice, not conversation. With that, he stepped off the mat, put on his shoes with the same careful attention he'd given his kata, and followed the coordinator back toward the main arena. Kelly clapped a hand on Jason's shoulder. Consider yourself fortunate, young man. Some study for years and never receive that much direct teaching. But he hardly told me anything, Jason said, puzzled. Kelly laughed, a rich, warm sound that echoed in the empty room. Exactly. With a wink, he too headed for the door, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts. In the main arena, the exhibition had resumed with a spectacular demonstration of Chinese wushu. Performers spinning and leaping with ribbons and weapons in a dazzling display of martial artistry. Yet throughout the stands, conversations continued to revolve around the earlier exchange between Chuck and Seagal. Riley Matthews had gathered a small group of younger fighters near the media area, her camera operator capturing their animated discussion. It changed how I see everything, a young woman was saying, her competitive medals gleaming under the arena lights. I've been chasing techniques, trying to expand my arsenal, but what Mr. Norris showed was that mastery isn't about having more moves, it's about perfect execution of fundamentals. For me, it was the control, another fighter added. Not just physical control, but emotional. Seagal was trying to provoke him the whole time, and Norris just didn't engage with the ego part at all. That's what separates a martial artist from a fighter. Miguel contributed, having joined the group. Anyone can learn to fight. Not everyone learns why not to. Riley's producer, watching from nearby, had to admit the footage was compelling not in the manufactured drama sense he'd initially pushed for, but in capturing a genuine moment of cultural transmission and its impact on the next generation. As the conversation continued, Chuck made his entrance at the Master's Pavilion on the far side of the arena. The crowd's reaction was immediate, a surge forward, phones raised, voices calling his name. Security guards moved to maintain order, but their intervention proved unnecessary. Chuck simply raised a hand slightly, and the chaotic energy settled, transformed by his calm presence into something more orderly, more respectful. He began moving through the crowd, giving each person who approached him his full attention. A word, a handshake, a signature, a photo. No rushing, no perfunctory interactions. Each moment complete in itself before moving to the next. Watching this from across the arena, Jason Miller found himself understanding something that had eluded him during years of training. The greatest masters didn't demand respect through force of personality or intimidation, they created it through the quality of their presence, their unwavering attention to the moment at hand, whether that moment was a high-stakes confrontation or a simple conversation with a fan. As he watched Chuck navigate the crowd with the same centered calm he had displayed in the ring, Jason realized he was witnessing not just a martial arts legend, but a living embodiment of the principles that underpinned all true mastery: humility, precision, presence, and the quiet confidence that comes not from believing in one's superiority, but from having nothing to prove. The contrast with Seagal's earlier behavior couldn't have been more instructive. And in that moment, surrounded by the spectacle and energy of the exhibition, Jason understood that he had received the greatest lesson of his martial arts journey, not through words or techniques, but through the simple observation of principle in action. Near the media platform, Riley's interview with the young fighters was concluding. Her producer approached, nodding reluctantly. "Okay, I get it now," he admitted. "This angle works. Authentic, meaningful, the viewers will connect with it." Riley smiled slightly. "Because it's real. Not manufactured drama, but actual impact." She glanced toward the Masters Pavilion, where Chuck continued to engage with a steady stream of admirers. That's the story worth telling. As the exhibition progressed toward its final demonstrations, the atmosphere throughout the arena had subtly transformed. The initial excitement remained, but it had been tempered with something deeper, a collective recognition of what true mastery looked like, not just in martial technique, but in character and conduct. And perhaps that had been Thomas Chen's intention all along, not merely to showcase physical skills, but to create a space where the deeper lessons of martial arts could be witnessed, absorbed, and carried forward by a new generation. The exhibition's energy mellowed as evening deepened, the earlier frenetic pace giving way to something more contemplative. The final demonstrations would soon begin, traditional forms performed by acknowledged masters, a deliberate return to foundations after hours of dynamic contemporary displays. In the competitors' lounge, screened from public view, a small group gathered around Jim Kelly and several other veterans of the martial arts world. Younger fighters listened intently, their usual competitive barriers temporarily dissolved in the presence of living history. "That's what people miss about the old days," Kelly was saying, his resonant voice carrying despite its measured tone. "We didn't have YouTube tutorials or Instagram followers. You learned directly from someone who had learned directly from someone else. Knowledge was personal, transmitted through relationship." "Like an unbroken chain," a young fighter suggested. Kelly nodded. "Exactly. And not just techniques, principles, philosophy, the why behind the how." He glanced around the circle. "Today I watched most of you record Chuck's exchange with Seagal on your phones. How many actually saw what happened?" The question hung in the air, gently challenging. A few shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had indeed been more focused on capturing the moment than experiencing it. "I did," Jason Miller spoke up from the edge of the group. "Or at least, I think I did." Kelly's expression warmed. "Tell us, then." Jason hesitated, aware of the attention suddenly directed his way. It wasn't about techniques. Mr. Seagal's Aikido entries were textbook perfect. Mr. Norris's responses were almost invisible, unless you knew what to look for. He paused, organizing his thoughts. It was about intention. Seagal was trying to prove something to Chuck, to the audience, maybe to himself. Chuck was just being Chuck. The boys got it. An older master nodded approvingly. When your intention is to prove yourself, you've already lost your center. When your intention is simply to express what you truly are, that's when real power emerges. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the VIP lounge, Chuck Norris sat alone for the first time since the exhibition began. He had declined numerous interview requests, posed for photos, signed autographs, and answered countless questions. Now, in a rare moment of solitude, he sipped water and gazed thoughtfully at the arena. Thomas Chen approached, carrying 2 small cups of tea. Without speaking, he placed one before Chuck and settled into the adjacent chair. A comfortable silence extending between them, the unforced quiet of old friends, who had long since moved beyond the need for constant conversation. After several minutes, Chen spoke. You taught them something important tonight. Chuck's weathered face creased in a slight smile. They taught themselves. I just provided the context. Chen shook his head, both amused and exasperated by his friend's characteristic deflection of praise. Always the humble one. Not humble, Chuck corrected gently. Accurate. They sipped their tea, watching as staff adjusted lighting for the final segment. Stephen left, Chen remarked. Sent his regrets about missing the closing ceremony. Apparently, an urgent dinner meeting with producers came up. Chuck nodded, unsurprised. He'll find his way eventually. Chen raised an eyebrow. You think so? After all these years? The path is long, Chuck replied simply. Some take detours. Across the arena, Riley Matthews was putting the finishing touches on what had evolved into a very different piece than she'd initially envisioned. Rather than focusing exclusively on the dramatic confrontation, she had expanded her scope to capture its impact on the younger generation of fighters. How a brief exchange had crystallized fundamental truths about martial arts philosophy. Her producer, initially skeptical, had come around after reviewing the footage. This has depth, he admitted. Not just spectacle, but substance. The network might actually go for it. In the fighter's warm-up area, Jason Miller practiced the subtle weight shift Chuck had demonstrated during their brief interaction. Not the flashy techniques he'd spent years perfecting, but the fundamental movement that made all others possible. Miguel found him there, repeating the same simple motion with intense concentration. What are you doing? We're supposed to be getting ready for the final presentation. Jason didn't break his focus. I am getting ready, more than I've ever been. Miguel watched for a moment. It's just a basic weight transfer. We learned that as white belts. But did we understand it? Jason countered, still moving. Did we feel it? Miguel hesitated, then stepped onto the mat beside Jason. Show me. In the main arena, the announcer welcomed 5 elderly practitioners who entered the ring with unhurried dignity, representatives of karate, kung fu, taekwondo, aikido, and judo, each having devoted over half a century to their respective arts. Their demonstration would feature no spectacular acrobatics, only the perfect execution of foundational patterns unchanged for generations. As they took their positions, Chuck and Chen returned to the VIP section. The audience, noticing Chuck's return, broke into spontaneous applause, not the excited frenzy from earlier, but something more measured, more respectful. Chuck acknowledged it, with a slight nod, then turned his full attention to the ring where the first master, an 83-year-old karate sensei from Okinawa, began a kata, performed essentially unchanged for 300 years. To untrained eyes, the demonstration might have seemed anticlimactic. The movements were slow, deliberate, without flash or theatrics. Yet a hush fell over the arena as the elderly master moved with breathtaking precision, each stance perfect, each transition flowing with the inevitability of water finding its level. In the fighters section, even the youngest competitors watched with newfound appreciation, many seeing for the first time the profound depth possible in movements they had practiced thousands of times without truly understanding. It's like he's discovered something new in techniques that are centuries old, Darius whispered. Not discovered, Miguel corrected quietly. Remembered. As the demonstration continued, Chuck watched with fullest attention, his focus unwavering, despite having seen such forms countless times throughout his life. Chen, glancing sideways at his friend, smiled slightly at this characteristic quality, Chuck's ability to approach even the most familiar aspects of martial arts with the fresh eyes of a perpetual student. Near the media platform, Riley paused her editing to watch the traditional forms, struck by how they distilled the evening's lessons into pure movement. The 5 masters, Though representing different styles, all embodied the same essential qualities Chuck had demonstrated: economy of motion, perfect timing, presence without ego, power without aggression. "That's it," she murmured, a final piece clicking into place. "That's the through line." As the masters concluded their demonstration, moving in unison through the foundational movements of their respective arts, an underlying unity became apparent: the same core principles expressed through different physical vocabularies. The crowd's response was unlike any other reaction throughout the evening. Not wild cheering or excited chatter, but a deep, resonant applause that acknowledged something profound had been shared. In that moment of collective recognition, the true lesson of the evening crystallized not in Seagal's showmanship or even in Chuck's masterful response, but in the timeless principles they had inadvertently illustrated. The contrast between performing martial arts and embodying them, between using techniques to impress others and integrating principles to transform oneself. As Chuck watched the masters bow in unison, a quiet satisfaction settled within him, not for any personal victory, but for the glimpse of understanding he saw dawning in the eyes of the younger fighters around the arena. For in that moment of clarity, the torch was being passed not through formal ceremony or elaborate technique, but through the silent transmission of principles that had sustained these arts through centuries of change. And in a world increasingly defined by noise and spectacle, perhaps that silent transmission spoke more eloquently than words ever could. Dawn broke over Las Vegas, painting the desert sky in watercolor strokes of amber and gold. The exhibition center stood quiet now, its vast parking lots nearly empty, save for a few maintenance vehicles. Inside, cleaning crews moved methodically through the arena, erasing all evidence of the previous night's spectacle. In a small coffee shop across the street, Chuck Norris sat alone by the window, a steaming cup untouched before him as he gazed thoughtfully at the building where, 12 hours earlier, an unplanned moment had crystallized decades of martial philosophy into a single, wordless exchange. His flight back to Texas wasn't until afternoon, allowing this rare pocket of solitude between public obligations. The door chimed softly as Jim Kelly entered, scanning the nearly empty space before spotting his old friend. He ordered at the counter, then made his way to Chuck's table, settling into the opposite chair with a soft grunt that acknowledged joints made stiff by decades of training. "Thought I might find you here?" Kelly said by way of greeting. "Still keeping farmer's hours after all these years?" Chuck smiled slightly. "Some habits stick." He gestured toward his untouched coffee. "Especially the good ones." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two veterans who had walked parallel paths through an industry that had both celebrated and misunderstood what they represented. Their friendship, spanning nearly 5 decades, had weathered the storms of fame and the challenges of aging in a youth-obsessed culture. "Quite a night," Kelly finally observed, his tone conversational, but his eyes keen. Chuck nodded. "Tomas put together something special. Not what he planned, I'd wager." Kelly's eyes crinkled with amusement. "But sometimes the best lessons aren't on the curriculum." "You've seen the clips, I assume?" Kelly asked after another comfortable silence. Chuck shook his head. "Haven't looked." Kelly chuckled, unsurprised. "Going viral, as the kids say. Your takedown of Seagal has been viewed more times than his last 3 movies combined." "Not a takedown," Chuck corrected mildly. "An exchange." "Tell that to the internet." Kelly sipped his coffee. "They're calling it the moment arrogance met authentic mastery." Something like concern flickered across Chuck's weathered features. "That's not helpful. For him or for martial arts." Kelly studied his friend thoughtfully. "Still protecting the path, even for those who stray from it." The path protects itself, Chuck replied. But unnecessary division doesn't serve anyone. Speaking of service, Kelly said, changing direction. That young fighter Jason Miller. I spoke with him after you left. Kid's got something special. Not just talent, but the right questions. Chuck nodded, his expression warming slightly. His grandfather taught him well. Foundation first, flash later. Reminds me of someone I knew back in the day, Kelly observed with a wry smile. Young karate champion who cared more about doing it right than looking good. Chuck's phone vibrated softly on the table. He glanced at the screen, a slight furrow appearing between his brows before he answered with a simple, Norris. Kelly watched as his friend listened, expression giving away nothing. I see, Chuck said after a moment. When? Another pause. That works. Same place is fine. He ended the call without elaborate goodbyes, returning the phone to the table. Trouble? Kelly inquired. Not exactly. Chuck took his first sip of coffee. That was Steven's assistant. He wants to meet before I leave town. Kelly's eyebrows rose. Well now, that's unexpected. Is it? Chuck asked mildly. Kelly considered this. Maybe not. What do you think he wants? Does it matter? The simple question hung between them, embodying the same principle Chuck had demonstrated the previous night, responding to what is, rather than speculation about what might be. They parted outside. Kelly heading to the airport for an early flight. Chuck returning to his hotel to prepare for the unexpected meeting. Their goodbye was characteristically understated, a firm handshake, a brief embrace, and a simple, until next time, that acknowledged the precious uncertainty of future meetings at their age. Back in his hotel room, Chuck spent 30 minutes in quiet meditation, a practice he had maintained daily for over 50 years, regardless of schedule or circumstance. Then, with methodical precision, he moved through a series of foundation exercises, each movement executed with the same focused attention he would give to a public demonstration. At precisely 10 o'clock, he made his way to the hotel's courtyard garden, a surprisingly tranquil space shielded from the strip's perpetual commotion by strategic landscaping. Steven Seagal was already there, seated at a table beneath a flowering desert tree, his customary sunglasses in place despite the dappled shade. As Chuck approached, he noted subtle differences from the previous evening. Seagal was alone, without the protective buffer of assistants and handlers that typically surrounded him. His clothing, while still black, was notably less flashy, a simple button-down and slacks, rather than the silk and jewelry of his public persona. Steven, Chuck greeted him simply, taking the seat opposite without waiting for invitation. Chuck. Seagal nodded once, his usual expansive gestures absent. Appreciate you making time. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Not the comfortable quiet Chuck had shared with Kelly earlier, but something more charged, filled with unspoken history and the weight of the previous night's exchange. About yesterday, Seagal finally began. Then paused, as if reconsidering his approach. Chuck waited, neither filling the silence nor pressuring its resolution. His posture remained relaxed but attentive, present without expectation. Seagal removed his sunglasses, setting them deliberately on the table, a small gesture that nonetheless signaled a shift toward greater authenticity. His eyes revealed more than perhaps he intended: fatigue, certainly, but also something less definable. Not quite humility, but perhaps its contemplative precursor. What you did in that ring, he continued, choosing his words with unusual care, wasn't what people think. Chuck raised an eyebrow slightly, inviting elaboration without demanding it. They're calling it a takedown. A humiliation. Seagal shook his head. But that's not what happened. You could have embarrassed me. You didn't. The observation hung in the air, notable not just for its accuracy but for the fact that Seagal had recognized it at all. Wasn't the point, Chuck replied simply. What was the point then? There was no challenge in the question, just genuine inquiry, perhaps for the first time in their long acquaintance. Chuck considered his response carefully, recognizing the rare opening before him. Not an opportunity to lecture or correct, but to share perspective with someone who might, finally, be ready to receive it. To honor the moment, he said eventually. To respond authentically to what was happening. Nothing more or less. Seagal nodded slowly, absorbing this. No agenda. No agenda, Chuck confirmed. Just presence. Something shifted in Seagal's expression. A subtle relaxation around the eyes. A loosening of tension held perhaps longer than he himself had realized. That's what I felt, he admitted. In that moment, when you redirected my momentum. No resistance. No domination. Just clarity. I've been thinking about something, Seagal continued after a moment. Something my first Aikido teacher told me that I may have forgotten along the way. He looked directly at Chuck now, his gaze uncharacteristically unguarded. He said true mastery isn't about what you can do to others, but about what you no longer need to do to yourself. Chuck's expression warmed slightly in recognition of the principle, one that transcended styles and systems to touch the core purpose of all martial training. Your teacher sounds wise, he said simply. He was. Seagal glanced away briefly, perhaps seeing memories of a younger self. A different path. I should have listened better. We all have those moments, Chuck offered. Not empty consolation, but the simple acknowledgement of shared human experience. Seagal regarded him with newfound curiosity. Even you? A slight smile crossed Chuck's weathered features. Especially me. Something unexpected happened then. Seagal laughed, a genuine sound without the performative quality that had characterized his public persona for so long. Somehow that's hard to believe, Chuck. You've always seemed, I don't know, certain. Committed, Chuck corrected gently. Not certain. There's a difference. Seagal considered this distinction, nodding slowly as he absorbed its implications. Commitment without certainty. That takes something special. Faith, Chuck suggested. In the process, if not always in yourself. After a moment, Seagal reached for his sunglasses but didn't put them on, instead turning them idly in his hands as if deciding whether the shield they provided was still necessary. I've got a seminar next month, he said finally. Young fighters, mostly. Been thinking about what to teach them. He glanced up, meeting Chuck's gaze directly. After last night, I'm reconsidering my approach. They'll respond to authenticity, Chuck offered. Young fighters always do. They can sense it, even if they can't name it. Authenticity, Seagal repeated, as if testing the word's weight. Been a while since I thought in those terms. He was silent for a moment, then added with surprising candor. Hard to find your way back to what's real, after so many years of performance. The way back is the same as the way forward, Chuck said. One step at a time, with honest intention. They rose simultaneously, the meeting reaching its natural conclusion. As they prepared to part ways, Seagal extended his hand not with the performative grip of the previous night's public handshake, but with simple directness. Thank you, he said, the words unadorned with qualification or explanation. Chuck clasped his hand firmly. Safe travels, Stephen. As Chuck walked the winding garden path, his phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from Jason Miller, the young fighter whose genuine search for understanding had caught his attention the previous night. "Mr. Norris," the message read, "I've been thinking about our conversation. You said the answer comes through practice, not discussion. I'm committing to basics for the next year. No competitions, no advanced techniques, just foundation work. My training partners think I'm crazy, but something about last night changed my perspective. Thank you for showing rather than telling." Chuck paused beside a small fountain, the gentle sound of flowing water creating a bubble of serenity in the desert city. He typed a brief reply. "The path reveals itself to those who stay on it. Keep going." As the morning sun climbed higher, Chuck made his way back toward the hotel entrance, ready to complete the final obligations of his visit before returning home. Behind him, the garden remained tranquil, ordered, alive with desert blooms that had evolved over millennia to thrive in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Like the desert plants, true martial mastery required not just technique, but adaptability. Not just strength, but resilience. Not just power, but the wisdom to know when and how to use it. Most importantly, it required roots that reached deep beneath the surface, drawing sustenance from hidden sources when external conditions grew harsh. These were the lessons Chuck had embodied in that brief exchange with Seagal. Lessons that couldn't be fully articulated in words, yet had spoken clearly to those prepared to receive them. Whether Seagal would integrate these insights remained to be seen. Whether the younger generation would carry them forward was equally uncertain. But uncertainty had never deterred Chuck Norris. After all, as he had told Seagal, mastery required commitment without certainty, faith in the process, even when the outcome remained unknown, faith that truth, expressed authentically, would find its mark with those ready to receive it. And sometimes, that truth spoke most clearly through silence, through action, without explanation, presence without performance, principle without proclamation. The weight of such silence carried further than the loudest boast, endured longer than the most dramatic spectacle. For in the end, true strength wasn't measured by victories over others, but by the inner alignment that allowed one to move through the world with authentic presence, responding to what is, rather than reacting to what isn't. Adapting without compromising, standing firm without rigidity. As his taxi pulled away from the hotel, Chuck gazed briefly at the exhibition center where, for a few moments the previous night, that path had been illuminated with uncommon clarity. Then he turned his attention forward, toward home and the continuing journey that had always mattered more than any destination. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.